What happens when an ordinary night at a high-end restaurant turns into a viral moment that shakes an entire community? A homeless veteran's plea for kindness leads to an intervention by Hollywood superstar Tom Hanks, forcing everyone to rethink the way we see those struggling around us. How will this life-changing moment end, and what lessons will be learned? Before diving in, share where you're watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will inspire and challenge you. The restaurant hummed with an energy that only came from exclusivity. La Bella Vita was the kind of place where reservations were made months in advance, where the glint of chandeliers was rivaled only by the diamonds on patrons' wrists. Waiters in crisp uniforms wove between tables like choreographed dancers, balancing silver trays laden with dishes that looked more like art than food. Amid this spectacle, the double doors at the entrance swung open, and in walked a man whose presence clashed sharply with the polished veneer of the establishment. Marcus. His clothes hung loose on his lean frame, layers chosen for practicality rather than style. The frayed cuffs of his jacket brushed his wrists as he clutched a canvas bag tightly to his side. His shoes, scuffed and mismatched, carried him cautiously onto the gleaming marble floor. Marcus hesitated near the hostess podium, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't here to dine, he couldn't afford a cup of coffee, let alone the lavish meals that patrons casually discussed. But he wasn't here to beg either. Hunger had driven him, sure, but something deeper compelled him to stand his ground. Pride, perhaps, or the memory of better days. The hostess, a young woman with a sharp smile and sharper instincts, spotted him immediately. Her gaze flickered over Marcus, taking in his unkempt hair and the well-worn bag at his side. She straightened her posture, her practiced politeness slipping into something colder. "Sir," she began, her tone teetering between feigned concern and impatience. "I'm sorry, but we don't allow," she caught herself, the word vagrants dying on her tongue. "We don't allow walk-ins without a reservation." Marcus nodded politely. "I'm not looking for a table," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I was just wondering if you might have any leftovers. Anything you could spare." Her expression hardened. "We don't do that here," she replied curtly, her smile now a thin line. A few patrons nearby noticed the exchange, their whispers a subtle reminder of Marcus's intrusion. "I see," Marcus said, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Thank you anyway." He turned to leave, but a voice from behind stopped him. It belonged to a waiter, a young man who had been watching the scene unfold from a distance. "Hold on," the waiter called, jogging over. "Wait a second." The hostess shot him a glare. "Daniel, don't. But Daniel ignored her. "Are you okay, sir?" he asked Marcus, his expression earnest. "I can grab something from the back." "That's enough," the manager interrupted, stepping in with an air of authority. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "We have a policy against soliciting, and we expect our staff to uphold that." "I wasn't soliciting," Marcus said, turning back to face them. "I was just asking for help." The manager's eyes narrowed. "Help doesn't come free," he said, his words dripping with condescension. "Not here." Marcus stared at him for a long moment. The hunger clawing at his stomach was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. With a quiet dignity, he nodded once more and stepped outside into the crisp evening air. Behind him, the restaurant door swung shut, cutting him off from the warmth and light inside. But the story wasn't over. Across the street, a man in a black coat lowered his phone, his expression unreadable. He had seen everything, and he had an idea. The door of La Bella Vita slammed shut behind Marcus, the sound swallowed by the hum of the city at night. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, clutching his bag tightly. The glow of the restaurant's opulent chandeliers spilled onto the pavement, creating a stark contrast with the dim, flickering streetlight above him. He pulled his coat tighter against the chill, not from the air but from the weight of humiliation. Across the street, a man stood leaning against a black sedan, phone in hand. His sharp features were partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his eyes were fixed on Marcus. The man, George Keller, was a producer for a local news network, always hunting for stories that would stir the public. He hadn't planned on stopping at the restaurant tonight. It had been an impulse, a whim, after a long day. But what he'd just witnessed had his instincts buzzing. George pushed off the car and crossed the street, weaving through the light traffic. He approached Marcus cautiously, his journalist's intuition warning him not to startle the man. "Hey," he said, his voice calm, measured. I saw what happened in there. Marcus turned, his face lined with exhaustion and suspicion. If you're here to gawk or pity me, save it, he said flatly. George held up his hands. Not at all, he replied. I'm a journalist. Name's George Keller. I'm not here to bother you, I just wanted to talk. Marcus eyed him warily, his grip tightening on his bag. I don't have a story for you, he said. I'm just another guy down on his luck. I think you're more than that, George said, his tone steady. The way you handled yourself back there, it wasn't just about food, was it? Marcus hesitated, then sighed. It's never just about food, he admitted. It's about respect, dignity. People don't see you as a person when you're out here like this. To them, you're just a problem. George nodded, his mind already spinning with possibilities. You said you're out here, does that mean? I've been homeless for a while now, Marcus interrupted, saving him the awkward question. But I wasn't always, he paused, his gaze distant. I served in the army for 10 years, got injured, came home, and couldn't find my footing again. The world moved on without me. The weight of his words hung in the air, and George felt a pang of guilt. Stories like Marcus's were everywhere, yet so few people truly listened. He took a deep breath. Listen, I don't know what your plans are for the night, but I'd like to help. Not with pity, not with charity, but with your story. I think the world needs to hear it. Marcus frowned. And what would that change? George smiled faintly. You'd be surprised. Let me make a call. Without waiting for a response, George stepped back and pulled out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen as he texted a name he knew would make waves. The reply came quickly on my way. Someone's coming who can make people pay attention, George said as he turned back to Marcus. Give it one shot. What have you got to lose? Marcus shrugged, his skepticism apparent, but he stayed put. They waited in silence for several minutes, the sounds of the city filling the void. Cars zipped by, and passers-by stole glances at the odd pair, one polished and professional, the other weathered by life on the streets. Then, headlights approached, bright and unmistakable. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, and as the door opened, Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. Tom Hanks stepped out, his face warm and familiar. He adjusted his scarf against the evening chill and approached Marcus with a kind smile. George told me a little about you, he said, extending a hand. I'm Tom. It's an honor to meet you. Marcus stared at him, then at George, then back at Tom. This has to be a joke, he stammered. No joke, Tom said, his voice soft but resolute. I'm here because people like you deserve better, and because I want the world to see what's really happening out here. As if on cue, a second SUV pulled up behind Tom's. From it emerged a small film crew, cameras and microphones at the ready. The sudden commotion drew the attention of onlookers, and within moments, a small crowd began to gather. The door of La Bella Vita swung open, the manager stepping outside to see what was happening. His eyes fell on the spectacle, and his face turned ashen when he recognized Tom Hanks standing next to the very man he had dismissed earlier. What's going on here? The manager demanded, his voice trembling slightly. Tom turned to him, his easy smile replaced by a steely resolve. We're about to have a conversation, he said, about kindness, about respect, and about second chances. The cameras began to roll, capturing every word. The restaurant's golden glow seemed to flicker under the weight of the unfolding spectacle. The manager, sweating under the spotlight of both cameras and public scrutiny, stood frozen in place. Patrons pressed against the windows, peering out with equal parts curiosity and unease. Is this some sort of stunt? The manager stammered, glancing between Tom Hanks and Marcus. His usual air of authority was replaced with visible discomfort. Tom's smile remained polite but firm. This isn't a stunt. It's a chance for you and everyone else watching to reflect on what just happened here tonight. George Keller stepped forward, gesturing for the cameraman to adjust the angle. We're live, he said, addressing Tom. Millions are tuning in right now. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside Tom, unsure how he'd gone from being shoved out of a restaurant to standing in front of rolling cameras alongside a Hollywood legend. Tom placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. Take a deep breath, he said softly. This is your moment, your story. Marcus nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he stepped closer to the camera. His voice wavered at first, but steadied as he spoke. My name is Marcus Evans, he began. I served in the U.S. Army for 10 years. When I came back, I struggled to adjust, lost my job, lost my home. And somewhere along the way, I lost my dignity. The crowd on the sidewalk grew larger, murmurs rippling through as passers-by stopped to listen. Even the diners inside La Bella Vita sat motionless, their meals forgotten. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I didn't come here tonight to cause trouble. I came because I was hungry. Because I hoped just for once that someone might see me as a person, not as a problem. The manager took a step forward, his face flushed. With all due respect, we have policies in place for a reason. This is a high-end establishment. And those policies, Tom interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut. Might need a little revising, don't you think? The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement. A woman near the front spoke up, her voice filled with indignation. How can you turn someone away for asking for help? He's a veteran. The manager faltered, glancing back at the restaurant staff, who stood awkwardly behind him. Some looked embarrassed, others exchanged nervous glances. George Keller seized the opportunity to ask a pointed question. Do you think your policies justify denying a man a simple meal, especially someone who served this country? The manager's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Marcus took a deep breath, the adrenaline of the moment pushing him to continue. I'm not asking for pity, he said. I've been through enough to know that pity doesn't change anything. What changes things is compassion. A little humanity. If one meal could restore a bit of hope for someone like me, is it really too much to ask? Applause broke out among the crowd, the sound reverberating down the street. Inside the restaurant, some diners began clapping too, their hands hesitant at first but growing more confident as others joined in. Tom turned back to the camera, addressing the audience watching at home. This isn't just about Marcus, he said. It's about the countless others like him, people who are overlooked, dismissed, and dehumanized every day. We all have a responsibility to do better. The cameras panned across the crowd, capturing tearful faces and nodding heads. A young woman stepped forward, holding a takeout container. I bought this for him, she said, offering it to Marcus. I'm sorry for what you've been through. Marcus hesitated before accepting the container. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The act of kindness sparked a chain reaction. More people approached, offering money, food, and words of encouragement. Marcus stood at the center of it all, overwhelmed but grateful. As the scene unfolded, George stepped back and whispered to Tom, "This is powerful. We're going to air this on the evening news tomorrow. It'll go viral before sunrise." Tom nodded, his gaze fixed on Marcus. Good. The world needs to see this. The manager retreated into the restaurant, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Meanwhile, the staff huddled near the kitchen, exchanging hushed conversations about what had just happened. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself at the heart of a movement he hadn't planned to start. The once dismissive crowd had transformed into a community rallying around him, and for the first time in a long while he felt seen. The chaos outside La Bella Vita reached a crescendo. The sidewalks were now packed with onlookers, their phones raised to record the scene. The restaurant's windows, once a barrier between luxury and the streets, became a screen for a reality no one inside could ignore. The tension crackled in the air as Marcus stepped forward, his face illuminated by the floodlights of the TV crew. The restaurant manager, visibly flustered, attempted to regain control. "Listen," he said, addressing the crowd and cameras, his tone desperate. "This is being blown out of proportion. We're a business. We have standards to uphold." And those standards, Tom Hanks cut in, his voice steady and deliberate, have nothing to do with humanity. Apparently he turned to Marcus, his presence commanding but his demeanor warm. "Would you mind sharing what you told me earlier? About your life? I think everyone here and watching needs to hear it." Marcus hesitated, his gaze flicking over the sea of faces watching him. There was fear in his eyes, but also a flicker of resolve. He nodded and took a breath, his voice quiet but clear. "I grew up in Detroit," he began, clutching his worn bag like an anchor. My mom worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table for me and my brothers. I joined the army right out of high school because I wanted to do something, anything to make her proud and to build a better life. He paused, the memories weighing heavily on him. The crowd leaned in, drawn to his every word. I served for 10 years, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. I saw things I'll never forget. Did things I'm still trying to make peace with. And when I came home, he paused again, this time his voice breaking slightly. When I came home, it was like I didn't belong anymore. I couldn't find a job. I lost my apartment. My family, he stopped, shaking his head. They tried to help, but I didn't want to be a burden. The crowd was silent, the gravity of his words settling over them. Even the restaurant staff who had gathered near the entrance seemed transfixed. And tonight, Marcus said, gesturing toward the restaurant, all I wanted was something to eat, just a little kindness. But instead I got reminded again that to some people I'm invisible, or worse, I'm nothing. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of anger and sympathy. The manager shifted uncomfortably, his face pale under the harsh lights. Tom stepped forward, his voice a calm but powerful presence. Stories like Marcus's aren't rare, they're far too common. And the way he was treated tonight, that's part of a bigger problem, a problem we all have a responsibility to fix. From the crowd, a young man in a suit raised his hand. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said, stepping forward. My name's David Harper. I work with a nonprofit that helps veterans find housing and jobs. Marcus, I'd like to offer you a spot in our program. We can get you a place to stay and help you get back on your feet. Marcus's eyes widened, the offer catching him off guard. You'd do that for me? David nodded. Absolutely. And I'll personally make sure it happens. The crowd broke into applause, but the moment was interrupted by a voice from the restaurant. This is ridiculous, one of the patrons shouted, standing up and throwing his napkin onto the table. We came here for a nice meal, not a spectacle. The comment drew glares from the crowd, but before anyone could respond, Marcus spoke. I'm sorry if my presence ruined your evening, he said, his tone polite but firm. But maybe you should ask yourself why someone like me, asking for help, feels like a spectacle to you. The man flushed and sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath. George Keller, sensing the moment was ripe, stepped closer to the camera. This is what tonight is about, he said, his voice carrying a sense of urgency. Not just Marcus's story, but the countless others like his. How many of us walk past people on the streets without even a second glance? How many of us assume someone's worth based on their appearance or circumstances? The restaurant manager, now visibly sweating, tried to interject. We're not heartless, he said, his voice defensive. But we have a business to run, we can't just what Tom interrupted, his tone sharp. Offer a piece of bread? A glass of water? A shred of dignity? The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, the energy palpable. The manager looked around, his confidence crumbling. We'll do better, he stammered. We'll revise our policies. Tom nodded, his expression softening slightly. It's a start, he said. But remember, policies don't create change. People do. As the commotion died down, Marcus turned to David. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. I don't know how to repay you. You don't have to, David replied with a smile. Just pay it forward when you can. The cameras continued to roll as Tom addressed the crowd one last time. Tonight isn't about tearing anyone down, he said. It's about building something better. Let's take this moment and make it count. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing down the street. Inside the restaurant, the patrons and staff seemed subdued, their earlier arrogance replaced with a quiet introspection. As the TV crew began to pack up, Marcus looked at Tom, his eyes brimming with emotion. Why did you do this? You don't even know me. Tom smiled, a warmth in his gaze. Because someone once helped me when I needed it, he said, and because everyone deserves to be seen. Marcus nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long while, he felt hope. The night air was still crisp as the crowd slowly dispersed, but the energy lingered, a spark that had been lit and couldn't be extinguished. The night after the events outside La Bella Vita, the story broke on every major news outlet. clips of Marcus's heartfelt words, Tom Hanks's intervention, and the crowd's reaction went viral. Social media was flooded with discussions about homelessness, veterans' struggles, and the responsibilities of businesses in addressing human dignity. For Marcus, the whirlwind of attention was overwhelming. David Harper's organization made good on its promise, securing Marcus temporary housing in a clean, quiet shelter designed specifically for veterans. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was a start. For the first time in years, Marcus had a bed to sleep in, a door to close, and a moment to breathe without watching his back. Here's the thing David said during their first sit-down meeting. "This isn't just about giving you a place to stay. We're going to help you rebuild. You served this country, Marcus. Now it's time for us to serve you." The words hit Marcus deeply. For so long, he had felt like a forgotten chapter in a book no one cared to finish. But now the attention had shifted in a way he couldn't have imagined. At La Bella Vita, the fallout was swift and brutal. The restaurant's Yelp page was bombarded with one-star reviews, and social media users vowed to boycott the establishment. How dare they treat a veteran like that? One viral tweet read. Another asked, if this is how they treat the most vulnerable, why would anyone support them? Inside the restaurant, the staff was shaken. The once busy dining room was eerily empty, the clinking of glasses and murmurs of conversation replaced by silence and the occasional phone call to cancel a reservation. The manager, who had been so dismissive of Marcus, found himself the target of both public outrage and corporate scrutiny. In a hastily arranged press conference, the restaurant owner, a stoic woman named Evelyn Cruz, addressed the scandal. "What happened at La Bella Vita was unacceptable," she began, her voice steady but remorseful. "I want to personally apologize to Marcus Evans and to everyone who has been affected by our actions. This incident does not reflect the values we strive to uphold." Evelyn announced several immediate changes, including a donation to a veterans aid organization, a free meal program for the homeless every Tuesday, and mandatory sensitivity training for all staff. "We can't undo the harm caused, but we can and will do better," she said. The changes were met with mixed reactions. Some applauded the effort, while others remained skeptical, calling it a calculated PR move. "Actions speak louder than words," one social media user wrote. Meanwhile, Marcus was adjusting to his new reality. As part of his housing arrangement, he met weekly with a counselor who specialized in helping veterans reintegrate into civilian life. Together, they worked on rebuilding his confidence and addressing the lingering effects of his trauma. "I don't know how to go back to who I was," Marcus admitted during one session. "You don't have to," the counselor replied. "You're not going back. You're moving forward." The simplicity of the statement struck Marcus. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future one where he wasn't defined by his past but shaped by his resilience. Tom Hanks stayed in touch, checking in on Marcus's progress and quietly supporting his journey. "I don't want this to be just a moment," Tom said during one of their phone calls. "I want it to be the start of something bigger." Tom's words weren't just empty promises. Using his influence, he launched a campaign called Seen and Heard, aimed at amplifying the stories of marginalized individuals and encouraging communities to take action. The campaign gained traction quickly, with celebrities, activists, and everyday people joining in to share their own experiences or support those in need. Marcus became an unexpected spokesperson for the campaign, sharing his story at events and in interviews. Though he was nervous at first, he found that speaking out gave him a sense of purpose. "I spent so long feeling invisible," he said during a televised interview. "Now I get to use my voice to make sure others don't feel the same." As weeks turned into months, the ripples of that fateful night continued to spread. La Bella Vita reopened under new management, with Evelyn Cruz stepping into the day-to-day operations to ensure the restaurant lived up to its promises. The free meal program became a cornerstone of their mission, with volunteers and staff working together to serve those in need. For Marcus, life was far from perfect, but it was moving in a direction he hadn't thought possible. With the help of David's organization, he found steady work as a community liaison for a veterans advocacy group. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. Every day he helped connect people to resources, sharing his journey as proof that change was possible. One afternoon, as Marcus walked home from work, he passed a small park where children played and parents chatted on benches. The laughter and warmth reminded him of what he had fought for all those years ago, a world where moments like this could exist. As he continued down the street, a man approached him, his face familiar. It was Daniel, the waiter who had tried to help him that night at La Bella Vita. "Marcus," Daniel said, extending a hand. "I've been following your story. I just wanted to say, I'm glad things are turning around for you." Marcus smiled, shaking Daniel's hand. "Thank you," he said, "and thank you for trying to help that night. It meant more than you know." Daniel nodded, his expression earnest. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." For Marcus, the journey was far from over, but the road ahead no longer felt insurmountable. He had been seen, heard, and valued, and that made all the difference. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and Marcus Evans barely recognized the life he was now living. It wasn't perfect, not by any stretch, but it was his, and it was filled with purpose. On a brisk morning, he stood in front of a modest podium at a community center, adjusting the tie he still wasn't used to wearing. A banner behind him read "Seen" and Heard, advocating for change in bold, hopeful letters. The room was packed, filled with supporters, veterans, and local leaders. Among them sat Tom Hanks and George Keller, their smiles encouraging as Marcus prepared to address the crowd. Cameras from several news outlets captured the moment, but Marcus didn't feel the nerves he once would have. He'd learned to channel his anxiety into strength, and today was no different. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped up to the microphone. The room quieted, all eyes on him. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice steady. 6 months ago, I stood outside a restaurant, hungry, cold, and convinced the world had forgotten about me. I'd spent years trying to survive, not living but simply existing, wondering if I would ever matter again. That night, everything changed. The crowd listened intently, some nodding in recognition of his story. "I didn't just get help that night," Marcus continued. "I got hope. Hope that I wasn't invisible. Hope that people could care about someone like me, someone who'd lost everything and didn't know how to start over." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "But more importantly, I learned something about myself. I learned that our stories matter. And when we share them, when we let others see the humanity behind the struggle, we make it impossible for the world to look away." Applause erupted, and Marcus smiled. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for the countless others who had felt invisible, powerless, and forgotten. After the event, Marcus mingled with attendees, shaking hands and hearing their stories. Many of them were veterans like him, some still struggling, others inspired by his journey. Each interaction reinforced his determination to keep pushing for change. Tom Hanks approached, clapping Marcus on the back. "You've got a gift," my friend Tom said. "Your voice is going to make a difference." Marcus chuckled, still not entirely used to the idea of being a public figure. "It's strange," he admitted. "I never thought I'd be standing here doing this." "That's what makes it powerful," Tom replied. "You're real. People need that." George Keller joined them, notebook in hand. "The documentary's almost done," he said, referring to the project he'd started after that fateful night. "It's going to shine a light on what's happening out there. But Marcus, you've become the heart of it." Marcus shook his head, humbled. "It's not just my story, George. It's all of ours." Later that evening, Marcus walked through the streets of the neighborhood he now called home. The air was crisp, and the soft glow of streetlights gave the city a quiet warmth. He passed a small diner, its windows fogged up from the heat inside. Through the glass, he saw a family laughing over plates of food, their joy a stark reminder of how far he had come. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down at the screen. It was a text from David Harper: "Meeting at the shelter tomorrow at 10. We've got big plans." Marcus smiled, tucking the phone back into his pocket. The shelter, now thriving with new funding and volunteers, had become his second home. He spent his days there helping others, mentoring those who were where he once was. It wasn't just work, it was his mission. As he continued walking, Marcus spotted someone sitting on a bench beneath the street lamp. The man's clothes were tattered, his shoulders hunched against the cold. The sight stopped Marcus in his tracks. Without hesitation, he approached, his heart heavy with familiarity. "Hey," Marcus said softly, sitting down next to the man. "Rough night." The man glanced up, his eyes weary but curious. "Yeah," he muttered. "Just trying to figure out my next move." Marcus nodded, understanding all too well. "I've been there," he said. "It's hard. But you're not alone." The man studied Marcus, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. "What would you know about it?" Marcus smiled gently. "More than you might think." He reached into his bag and pulled out a business card for the shelter. "Look," he said, handing it to the man. "This place saved my life. They'll help you if you let them." The man stared at the card for a long moment, then slipped it into his pocket. "Thanks," he said quietly. Marcus stood, his breath visible in the cold air. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and don't be afraid to ask for help. It's out there." As he walked away, Marcus felt a familiar warmth in his chest. He didn't know what the man would do with the card, but he hoped it would lead him somewhere safe. Back at his small apartment, Marcus looked out the window at the city below. His journey was far from over, but for the first time in years he felt at peace. He had found purpose, a voice, and a reason to keep moving forward. The world hadn't changed overnight, but it was changing one conversation, one act of kindness, one story at a time. And Marcus knew that as long as he kept fighting, kept showing up, there was hope for a better future. For himself, for others, for all of them.